Hello folks, the Why Guy here again. Welcome to my home on this very beautiful summer day. The name of this video is called The Why Guy Agrees with God About Sacrifice. You know, Christendom continually teaches that life is all about God's will and not our own. Am I right about that? Well, I have something to offer about this subject, but unfortunately most will consider it heresy. All right, so don't burn me at the stake quite yet. Okay, I'm only offering an opinion based on critical thinking, logic, and practicality. All right, so there's a conundrum with me. There is about God's will that needs to be addressed. When Jesus prayed, "Father, let your will be done and not my own," you know, this was referring to the cross. But unfortunately, there's at least two, possibly more, two ways to interpret God's will about the purpose for the cross. I bet you've never heard that one before, have you? Well, here's interpretation one, and most will be familiar with this. All right. As myself and others have been taught, God wanted Jesus to lay down his life on the cross and be a sacrificial lamb for the sins of the world, and seemingly written in Scripture. Seemingly is very important. Okay. However, what is also plainly written in Scripture, in Matthew 9:13, 12:7, Hebrews 10:5, is how both Jesus and God made it clear that a sacrifice, lamb or otherwise, isn't required by God, nor does he delight in it. So which is it, folks? Which is it? For both scenarios to be true, it would require God to be either indecisive or bipolar, in my opinion. Okay? Now here's interpretation two, which is kind of where I'm leaning now. And most will consider it heretical. Yes, I believe it was true that it was God's will for his son to willingly go to the cross, but not for the purpose for Jesus to be a pagan sacrifice, like an innocent animal who sheds his blood to appease God's disgust with sin, but for the purpose as a means to demonstrate God's great love. So how was it demonstrated? Well, by forgiving people instead of punishing mankind for the murder of his son. It's that simple, folks. So what I'm proposing solves a dichotomy between it being God's will for Jesus to be sacrificed, which, by the way, is just a word that they used back then for murder and killing. That's what the word was. I know the religious folks thinks it's something else entirely, but I'll prove myself in a moment here. But anyway, it solves a dichotomy between, you know, God's will for Jesus to be sacrificed versus how it's not God's will for a sacrifice. Okay, considering that it's written that he never required nor delighted in such a practice. There's got to be an answer for that, because you can't have it both ways. It just doesn't add up. Some might be thinking, but why, Guy? What about all those places in Scripture where it's written how God provided a sacrifice? You know, for an example, for Abraham, or how God accepted Abel's sacrifice over Cain's. And then later on in the New Testament, it says that there can be no forgiveness for sin without sacrifice. You see, I know how it goes. All right, so let's start with Abel first. Is it written that God told him to make a sacrifice? Is it written? No. Well, then who told Abel to do such a thing if God didn't? Follow me here for a minute. Remember, apply some critical thinking. Would God honestly tell Abel to do something that he didn't require or delight in? That wouldn't make sense. In my opinion, Abel started, or at least adopted from other people, their pagan practices of sacrifice. Folks, there was a lot more than 4 people at the time of that story. Okay, when Cain killed Abel, a lot more than 4 people. Read the story. The earth had other populated cities. So why is it written that God accepted Abel's sacrifice over Cain's? That's the main issue here, right? Well, I believe that there's 3 possible reasons. 1, Moses wrote the story. He did. And he promoted the law. that required sacrifice. See, so there might be a motive there, all right? Or 2, as corrupted as people are, God still accepts us on our level of understanding, rather than requiring us to be perfect in our understanding before accepting our attempts to please Him. Well, folks, Abel was no different than us in that respect. And 3, the heart and motive of Abel was more pleasing to God over that of Cain's jealous attitude. That's exactly what was taking place. That's why Jesus said in Matthew 9:13 that I desire compassion and not sacrifice. Notice what it says about Abel's sacrifice, though. This part's cool. In Hebrews 11:14, quote, by faith, that's the first time it was mentioned, Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith, there's number 2, he was commended as a righteous man, and when God spoke well of his offering. And by faith, there's 3, okay, he still speaks even though he is dead. Okay, that's hyperbole, by the way. Well, the context obviously is all about faith and not about sacrifice. All right? Thus the faith was pleasing to God and not the sacrifice. Are you with me? Okay, it could have easily been written as by faith Abel offered God a better attitude than Cain did, and that was pleasing to God. So it's not that God accepted the sacrifice, but God accepted the faith. I don't know exactly where it is in the scripture, but where it says it's impossible to please God without faith. There's a verse that says that in the New Testament somewhere. Just popped into my head. Anyway, let's move on to Grandpa Abraham. Okay? And how Grandpa Abraham did not kill his son Isaac, but God supplied a ram to be sacrificed. Okay, let's move on to that. Abraham at this time in history was still part of the nomadic, pagan-influenced barbaric tribe at this time in history. And what did barbaric, paganistic people do back then? Well, they made blood sacrifices to God or to a god. That's what they did. Now get this, the story says that God had an angel stop Abraham. But why? I'm going to tell you, in my strong opinion, not because of it only being a test, as I was taught, and I'm going to disprove that in a moment, but because it wasn't God's will for Abraham to sacrifice his son. Get it? You've got to at least consider that option. Well, a test is a doctrine of men, as I was taught, and it isn't mentioned in the passage, in any passage that references Abraham. The word tempt is synonymous to the word test in the Koine Greek. Quote, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tested by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt or test anyone. See, that's in James 1:13, second set of notes. That's in James 1:13 if you want to look that up. So either James is lying or doctrines of men are. Okay, you just have to decide. Something else for you to decide. Moving on. Is murder evil or not? You got to decide. Because the religious world wants to substitute the word murder for the word sacrifice, and somehow that makes murder okay, and I'm going to prove that as well. The verse that's used that makes it all okay, that's often used, because it's written in the book of Genesis, that God said to Abraham, quote, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I'll tell you about. That's pretty convenient. Anyway, I honestly believe, I'm just leaving my notes here for a second. Yeah. Not only am I going to claim that it was Abraham's idea, he wasn't sure which mountain he was willing to climb at the time. Okay. Anyway, follow me here for a second. I conjecture that Abraham's pagan mind told him to do this. And he simply gave God credit for saying it. You know, folks, I'm going to leave this again just for a second. This isn't vanity speaking, but I can't tell you how many girls knew, they knew that God, back in the day when I used to be young and good looking, I can't tell you, and this isn't vanity or pride from my part, I can't tell you how many girls knew for sure that God told them that I was supposed to be their future husband. My wife will tell you about that. That is a fact. That's just how it happened, all right? Well, anyway, where was I? Okay. Now, that's just one example of God telling, but let me give you an example in the same context of what Abraham thought God told him to do. All right? Let me offer a modern day example of what God supposedly told Abraham to do, even though religious people, ironically, adore Abraham and applaud him for his attempt to murder his son. One such barbaric act is described in this headline, quote, from attorney, full colon, woman thought God told her to kill her sons, close quote. Now, this is recent. When I read the article, excuse me, the police officers who showed up on the scene, they were so disgusted with what happened and how she slit their throats and just did what she did. I bet you some of those poor cops are going to have nightmares from that. Because some of them were sick. They actually got physically sick when they came up on the scene, what I read about. Anyway, Google this topic, and you'll discover many examples of these kinds of horrendous acts. So why do Christian, Jewish, and Islamic religions let Abraham off the hook? You know, when in most cases, all three societies would either imprison or put to death such a person as Abraham. You know what? If it wasn't a made-up story by Moses, then my critical thinking tells me that Abraham's pagan mind had to be appeased. So God supplied a ram to settle the issue in Abraham's mind. Or otherwise, maybe sometime in the future, he might have tried to kill Isaac again. You know? Yes, this is a practical supposition on my part. I realize that. But it explains far more than the Christian dance of how Isaac represented the sacrifice of Jesus, which in my opinion I now consider pure BS. You know, if what Christendom claims is true about this, then why didn't God simply allow Abraham to slit Isaac's throat like that lady did to her kids, shed his blood, and then accept the sacrifice and simply raise Isaac from the dead? Since God supposedly required the same sacrifice regarding Jesus, and we know the end result of that. All right? For the sake of sanity, please reconsider what you've been taught and think outside of that indoctrinated, pagan influence box that religion has put you in, if you're one of those who are watching this and are total disagreement. Okay? Lastly, the issue of what about there can be no forgiveness for sin without the shedding of blood. You know, I don't mean this is any kind of a put down to anyone, but it's obvious to me that most Christians don't even have a clue what the context of Hebrews 9:22, where this came from, is all about. But they ignorantly pull it way out of context to disprove where it's written that God never required a sacrifice. They do it all the time. From a Greek New Testament, the very first line of Hebrews 9:22 states, thus, according to the law. Well, bam, that's the context. It's so obvious. The first 5 words. Read the chapter. It's all about the law. It was the law of Moses and not God that required a sacrifice. That's why it says there can be no forgiveness for sin without the shedding of blood. That's what the law required. All right? The law, not God, makes the claim that there can be no forgiveness without blood. And that's the point that the writers of Hebrew was trying to make in that particular chapter. Now, here's something else to take note of. From God's perspective, Jesus was slain before the foundation of the world, spoken about in Revelation 13:8, before there was such a thing as sin. Did you get that? Isn't that interesting? This alone should speak volumes and upset a few theological carts. Anyway, regardless, my point is this. The word slain is synonymous with the words murder and slaughter in Koine Greek, and not the word sacrifice. This is why the Bible doesn't say that Christ was sacrificed before the foundation of the world. If it's all about the need for a sacrifice, wouldn't Scripture have used the word sacrifice instead of the word slain? Coming close to a closing, in Acts 2:23, this passage confirms that Jesus was murdered by men. rather than being a sacrifice that was required by God. Quote, him, meaning Jesus, being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. It just simply means God knew it was going to happen. You have taken, and by wicked hands, God doesn't have wicked hands, and by wicked hands have crucified and slain. That's even from a perverted Latin-based Bible. It even says that. Can you believe it? Anyway, notice how it doesn't state that Jesus was crucified and sacrificed. The phrase, you have taken, is referring, and in context, to men and what they do. And it was by their hands, not God's, okay, that Jesus was murdered. What I find interesting in my Coin Greek New Testament, my Jonathan Mitchell's Amplified Greek New Testament, how does it say it in that one? I find this fascinating. I have a quote here from that. States that it says that Jesus was assassinated and nailed to a stake. Again, the word sacrifice isn't in any of these passages referring to what happened to Jesus on the cross. That's why I'm rethinking this stuff. You know, because there is nothing in Scripture where it's written that God required Jesus to be sacrificed. Yet there's more than one place where it plainly states that God doesn't require a sacrifice. Once again, the Christian religion believes something that is not written in the Bible, yet completely ignores what is. Isn't that odd? So in closing, so when you read how Christ died for the sins of the world, the word "for" can easily be defined or interpreted as a result of man murdering Jesus, which is what that verse in Acts says, just as easily as believing it was a sacrifice for man, substituting Jesus for the sins of mankind, okay? Like all of us were taught. So, in doing this video, I mean no offense by making people think outside of their indoctrination, you know, well, coming up with the idea for this video. I mean no offense, I really don't. So it's been long enough. Scroll down to the Show Me More sections and check it out, you know. And a lot of people are going to consider me heretical on this and give me a thumbs down. And if you are going to leave a comment that reflects that thumbs down, that disagreement, it had better be polite comment, or else I'll just delete your stupid comment. Actually, I shouldn't call it stupid. But anyway, thank you for viewing.